Welcome to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio, bringing you insights and strategies to help you create a magnificent and fulfilling second half of life. Here's your host, certified professional retirement coach and best-selling author, Dr. Dorian Mintzer.
I want to welcome everybody to my fourth Tuesday Revolutionize Your Retirement Interview with Expert series. I'm Dorian Mintzer, owner of Revolutionize Retirement and your host for this series. So without any further ado, let me tell you a little bit about Mark Miller, who's my guest. And the topic today, just to remind you, is the concept of Jolt, or events that happen. And his book and what he will be talking about today are stories of trauma and transformation. Not everybody, when there's a jolt or a trauma in life, does have a positive transformation, but many people do. And I think today we're going to learn about that and what's involved in it. And I'm just delighted that Mark will be here. So for more than a decade, Mark Miller has researched and written about what motivates people to reinvent their lives. He's a naturally recognized expert on retirement and aging. He writes a column for Reuters, and contributes to the New York Times and other national news outlets. He's the author of Jolt, Stories of Trauma and Transformation, which tells the stories of people transformed by growth following trauma and the new paths that they pursue. Some of these people are on missions to help others or to make things right in the world, and others embark on new careers. Some other people simply find that their relationships grow deeper, or they seek a stronger spiritual dimension in their lives. I want to say that I've had the opportunity to read the book, and I highly recommend it to people. It's quite lovely. The stories are very moving. The way that he talks about what has happened in people's lives it's excellent. So I just want to encourage people to read the book. So before we end too, Mark will mention a special offer he's offering to people who are listening and part of the call today. So we'll mention that at the end, because he now has a new podcast that he's doing probably weekly, although it may not be totally weekly. It's a subscription series, and he's going to be offering a discount to everybody who's listening, but we'll tell you more about that a little bit later. Mark, welcome. I'm delighted that finally we found a time that works for both of us. And
Dory, thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. So tell me, let's start out with just how you got interested really in covering retirement and aging and in general, and then also how you got interested in writing a book about the after effects of trauma.
My interest in covering retirement and aging really started with an interest in life transformation and the way people's lives change at midlife. And it actually started with a personal observation around the time that I was turning 50, more than a decade ago. And I was noticing a lot of my friends starting to talk about retirement, looking ahead and thinking, gee, what am I going to do when I reach that age? And a lot of the discussion was around the idea of reinvention. I don't want to do retirement. I have to figure out what's next for me, that sort of thing. And I was hearing so much about this from people that I just was intrigued with it. And I was looking for some new ideas at the time. I worked at the time, I live in the Chicago area, and I worked back then for the company that publishes the Chicago Tribune, and we were looking for some new product ideas. And so I proposed this idea of a magazine and website that would focus on this topic, how does life transition to new retirement. And we did, in fact, launch that. It was a magazine and website by the cleverly named Satisfaction, kind of playing off the Rolling Stones song. And it only lasted a few years for reasons I won't bore the listeners with. But I was really hooked on the whole topic and decided I wanted to keep going further. So that's the point when I went off and became an independent journalist and started covering retirement. And then the topics that I covered pretty quickly expanded to the wider range of things one writes about on retirement and aging. So the personal finance side of that, healthcare, midlife career stuff. I do a lot on public policy subjects like Social Security and Medicare. But over the years, I've continued to have an interest in this original topic of life transition and how people's lives change. And I've done a lot of writing about it over the years, and that's where Jolt connects, if you will.
Oh, that's great. So why don't we start with some of these stories? You say that they're hiding in plain sight. What do you mean by that? And can you give us some examples?
Sure. If you don't mind, let me start with trying to just expand a little bit about the definition of what a jolt is. I think
good idea.
Of the book, I think it might be helpful because then when I start talking about the hidden in plain sight, I think it'll make a little more sense.
Yeah.
So the book really is looking at, as you mentioned in the introduction, this idea of positive transformations following a traumatic event. So number one, it runs counter to the main narrative that we hear all the time about trauma, which of course is post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. And Jolt is about people who have come through traumatic events transformed in ways that they put a really high value on. It does not mean to say that when we talk about growth and transformation, it doesn't mean that their pain or their suffering is vanquished, and it doesn't mean that they've gone back to where they were or they have not necessarily recovered their former lives. It's more like this. It's more like people who have built a new life around the old. It's sometimes this idea of post-traumatic growth gets wrapped up with the idea of resilience. People often shift into a conversation with me about resilience. And it's a different thing. It's kind of related, I would say. They're cousin ideas, but it's not quite the same thing. Resilience is you're knocked down, you manage to get back up and keep going down the path you were on. The growth idea is that you're getting up and you are transformed. You're on a new path, a different path. I am not trying to suggest with this book that this is a universal experience. Certainly it's not. And when growth happens, I think it's a wonderful thing, but I'm not trying to convey here that somebody who is already suffering from a traumatic life event should somehow be carrying an extra burden by feeling that somehow they're, why am I not feeling growth? So they feel worse about themselves because they suddenly, I'm hearing that I should be turning into this superhero. And the psychologists that I interview in the book talk about this as they never really have an expectation of growth for people. That if it happens, it's good, that it's terrific, but it's not something that we want to press people to feel that they should be experiencing. So the book is really a journalistic exploration of what happens when this growth occurs. And I look fairly deeply into the process. How does the growth occur? And really what I conclude based on, I should stop and say that there's quite a bit of peer-reviewed academic research and literature on this. And so the book is not about that, but it's informed by. And so I reviewed quite a bit of that and interviewed a number of people who have done kind of clinical research around this. And what I conclude is that what happens in this phenomenon is this, that trauma makes people hyper aware that life holds this potential for the unexpected and the painful. And it can make people very fearful or anxious, or it can lead to positive change in the way that people see themselves. Common phrases or statements that you hear from people who have experienced growth are things like this. For example, I'm much stronger than I ever imagined I was. If I'm living through this, I could live through just about anything. Realizing that they do have the ability to cope. So those are the under the hood aspect of it. And then in the book, I explore a pretty wide range of different types of traumatic events. It ranges from the loss of a spouse or the loss of a child or a life-threatening health problem. I have a couple of stories related to terror attacks, natural disasters, plane crash, the famous Miracle on the Hudson plane crash comes into play in the book, the loss of sight, or different types of emotional trauma. And then also a really wide array of types of responses to the trauma. As you, I think, alluded to in the introduction, that might be greater compassion for others. It might be a new sense of social purpose and mission. It could be a new life direction. It could be just a sense that relationships with people who you're close to become deeper and more meaningful. And sometimes it involves revival of interests in your life. It could be something that's a hobby or something in the arts, either a new interest or refocusing on the old interests. I look at how the transformations happen, how and why people come out stronger. What is it like to go through this type of transformation? Why does it happen to some people, not to other people? There's a chapter on the role of faith and spirituality. And so that's a summary of this. And to your question about hidden in plain sight, I guess I'd say this, that we see stories. Actually, I get asked this question a lot, like, where did you find the people whose stories you tell? And that's where this idea that the stories are hiding in plain sight comes from. It's in the news all the time. I'll cite a couple of examples. Sandy Hook or Parkland, both horrific stories of gun violence and mass murder. When we read about those stories and what goes on in the aftermath, got people who have been transformed by these traumatic events and are on a mission. And it was really interesting to me reading about Parkland a year ago that the Sandy Hook parents were back in the news at that point. A lot of the parents there who became dedicated to gun violence prevention. And they come into these stories, they're quoted, but rarely do the storytellers stop and zoom in to look closely at what motivates that. It's understandable because the reporters are covering whatever the breaking news of the moment is, but just to stop and meditate on how remarkable this is, the kind of the courageousness and I just think to stop and take a look at what is this phenomenon. So what I'm doing is slowing this down to slow motion, if you will, to stop and look at just one particular piece of this frame. Another example of a story that has been a person who's been in the news very much in the last few years, a story that I tell in the book, is the story of Lucy McBath, who lost her son to gun violence in Florida, I think 5 or 6 years ago, and became very involved in gun control, gun prevention efforts, and emerged on the national stage. In 2016, she was involved in a group called Mothers of the Movement, which involved a number of other mothers who had lost children to either gun police violence. It included the mothers of Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, some others. And she wound up making an appearance at the Democratic National Convention in 2016. So here was this person she came from a background as a flight attendant. This is a person who was not particularly political and found herself moving into this very public advocacy role. There she was on the stage of the Democratic Convention in 2016 speaking to an audience of 20,000 people and a televised audience of perhaps many millions of people. There's an example of somebody whose life was just utterly transformed, and the story was, I guess, fits this category of hidden in plain sight. The final chapter, the following chapter about Lucy is that she wound up running for Congress last fall in Atlanta and winning, and she is now a freshman member in the House and is stirring things up on gun policy issues. So the stories are there. One last story for you as an example of the hiding in plain sight is a gentleman whose story I tell in the book. His name is Bill Pelkey, and Bill is a lifelong dedicated death penalty abolitionist advocate. And I first heard about Bill as I was researching the book one day. My wife and I was sitting on the porch reading the paper, and she was reading a story about something going on with death penalty abolition. And just as an aside, there's a quote in the story from this man named Bill Pelkey, and it describes Bill as a death penalty abolitionist who had become active in this movement after the tragic and very violent murder of his own grandmother in the 1970s. And then the story just marches on from there. And my wife hands me the story and says, "You should check out. He sounds like he fits your book." And so I do. And of course he did. And this is a remarkable story. But again, this is what I mean by hiding in plain sight. They're there. They're making noise in many cases. We just aren't paying enough close attention to it.
And I think that's one of the wonderful things your book does. As I said, having read it, many of the stories are stories that we all have heard about, not all of them, but many of them. And even since I've read it, of just being more aware. And I love the way that you integrate some of the research into it too. So it's really got some good footing to it. But even thinking, and we'll get into that maybe a little bit later, but just this week there was this sadness of one of the Sandy Hook fathers who killed himself, and then another student from Parkland. So clearly not everybody is able to sustain, to make that transition and to sustain the growth. And I know we'll get into that in a little bit. Let's focus now on those who are able to. Could you maybe talk a little more about just what the process of change is that trauma survivors experience as they begin to grow? It just might be helpful to look at that. Yeah.
Sure. One thing I would say about it is it's not a cookie cutter sort of phenomenon, which I guess is not surprising to say, right? We're talking about human experience here. It's not, in most cases, I would say it's not an overnight process. It's not like trauma happens, you wake up the next day, and the light bulb is off. I found that the amount of time involved can vary quite a bit. It can really stretch out over years. And sometimes I would say trial and error. People try one thing out, try another thing out, don't find the right thing right away. An example of that, I guess, that I could cite is the story of Liz and Steve Alderman. And Liz and Steve lost a son in his early 20s in the World Trade Tower on 9/11. And Steve was a physician, Liz a teacher, and also a stay-at-home mom, combination of those things. And they were really searching in the aftermath of their son Peter's death for a way to memorialize him and to make sense of everything. And she went through, in particular, a number of different things that just wound up not feeling right. She initially got involved in the group that was working on the 9/11 memorial at the southern tip of Manhattan. That didn't feel right. She kind of ventured into a couple of things, and maybe 2 years later, she was up late watching television. She was often up very late at night and suffered from insomnia at that point in her life, and saw this feature about a researcher at Harvard who was doing work in Africa and Southeast Asia in post-conflicts where societies had experienced mass traumatic events, genocidal events. And this was a psychologist who was working to figure out ways to provide mental health services in some of these countries. And the feature was shot of this guy doing some work, I forget where in Africa, but she just bolted straight up in her chair, and just something about this story grabbed her. And the next morning she's talked to Steve about it. And the next week they were at Harvard talking to this researcher, and they wound up starting a nonprofit organization named for their son that works to establish mental health clinics in societies, and mostly in Asia and Africa, that have experienced these sort of mass trauma level events. And so one of the things that I found very intriguing about Liz and Steve's story is, it was this longer process that involved a number of steps. The other thing was that their ultimate response bore tangential relationship to the specific trauma they had experienced. Liz talks about the people that they work with in the clinics have experienced trauma far worse than they did. So this ability that she and Steve have to empathize with people from completely different walks of life than theirs, from completely different cultures and backgrounds, and to reach out halfway around the world to help, which to me was a really stunning story. But they also serve as an example of how the process can vary quite a bit. And then I will say that sometimes it is almost instantaneous. I do have a couple of stories in the book about people who just right away know what they want to do and they're off to the races, although I think that most of them kind of had something brewing in the background anyway, that I just have trouble believing that these ideas really spring fully formed in an instantaneous way.
So with all of the stories, what sense or themes have you seen of what the internal process seems to be for those that do experience this as a jolt in a positive way? Do you have a sense of that?
I think a lot of it is this desire to make sense of what has happened. I think there's a fundamental drive that people have to sense of meaning and purpose in their lives. And when these traumatic events they really blow apart your sense of the world and the life you're living. We all walk around with this sense of what our world is, and that it moves out in kind of concentric circles, right? There's your home where you live, your immediate family, your loved ones, your neighborhood, your community, perhaps the city you live in, or the state that you live in. And then a broader conception of the country, the world, et cetera. And we have these kind of assumptions that are driven by experience, really. And then we have these expectations about how life will continue to play out. But as we know, life is unpredictable. So I think that trauma blows up for many people, blows up that sense of what life was. So there's a need to put it back together again. And that's what this process is about, is how do I put it back together?
With that, it makes perfect sense of trying to make sense of the world. And I know you spend some time in the book talking about the role of faith and spirituality. Do you find that it really taps into, when you think about it, faith and or spirituality as a way of us trying to make sense of sometimes things that just seem senseless or impossible to process? What have you found as people become more spiritual, have you found? Or do you find that do people have that kind of backdrop of a spiritual or a faith-based context that helps them in these traumatic times?
In some cases, yes. And I tell some stories in the book of people who have chiefly, I would say, fallen back on their faith. I think again about Bill Pelkey, who I mentioned earlier, the death penalty abolitionist. And I tell the story also of one of his kind of compatriots in arms in that battle, a lovely lady named Marietta Yeager, both very devout Catholics, and who kind of their Catholic faith really informs their feelings about the value of life and the importance of forgiveness, without going too deeply into that, because I'm hardly an expert on theology or Catholicism. But I explore this a little bit in the book. So there are a number of examples of people like Marietta and Bill who are informed by their faith. And I'm sure there are people out there who come to faith as a result of a traumatic event. And when you talk to researchers about this, they're, at the risk of a pun, they're agnostic on the point. They acknowledge that faith can play a role, but I think they're reluctant to say that, for example, I didn't find anybody who said that you're more likely to undergo this kind of positive transformation as a result of faith. But the stories are there, and I think it's an important narrative.
So Susan I'm going to integrate questions as they seem appropriate as we go along now. And Susan from Victoria, British Columbia says, are there surrounding conditions common to people who have transformational responses to trauma?
I think one that I did find is a supportive community, the ability to be able to reach out and to rely on others, whether that's a spouse or a friend. Some researchers think that women are more like positive transformations than men, and the reason is, at the risk of making a gross generalization, is that, and maybe you found this in your work, Dory, I'd be interested to know, that women tend to be a little more social in working through these issues. They're more likely to reach out to others, less likely to bottle up what they're thinking, as men sometimes do. And so that may be a factor. And another is that as people start to wade into making changes, let's say deciding to volunteer in an organization would be an example, that there's self-reinforcing phenomenon there. You're with others who share your views. You're in a social environment that is supportive and reinforcing. I think those are a couple of factors that can drive all this. I also have a chapter in the book titled, Who is Most Likely to Experience Post-Traumatic Growth and What If You Don't? And I actually interview a couple people who did not, or say they did not at any rate, a little edgy about it. I try to go down that path and look at what are the factors that drive this.
Can you speak a little more to that, of what you found have been some of the factors that seem to push people to the more growth, or those that sort of say they haven't? I kind of remember that chapter where people said they hadn't, but yet there still had been people putting more focus on relationships, or there were just life taking on more meaning, or more present meaning, it seemed to me, as I read that text.
Right. So the factors, I think, include people who tend towards a more optimistic life outlook. In other words, their orientation is towards optimism, the willingness to face fear, the courageousness involved there. We talked about faith and spirituality. That can be an important factor. Seeking and accepting social support. Physical fitness actually can be a factor. Researchers have found people who are more active and seems to help. And those are some of them. But there's no one, formulaic response to that, I would say.
Right. I wanted to comment on what you were asking in terms of my clinical work. I do find that women tend to in general, again, it's a stereotype, have more of that connectedness to other people. But what I have found really interesting in my clinical work is people deal differently with that sense of being vulnerable. And I do find that some men clam up and others, it opens them. And in a way that maybe they haven't been open before to that sense of vulnerability, which I think ties into that sense of mortality. And that I've just seen amazing changes that happen with people, men and women. And it seems to me it's that tied in somehow with the vulnerability and mortality. I just wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think mortality is a very important theme because a lot of these traumatic events push us to contemplate mortality. And one of the questions I get a lot about the book is it possible to have the post-traumatic growth experience without the trauma, the Diet Coke version, if you will. I think this ties back to the idea of mortality because people who have gone through the traumatic events, in many cases, not all, have been forced to contemplate mortality, and that's pushed them to realize that life is not limitless. We don't have an endless amount of time, and how do you make sense of the time that you do have and make the best use of it in a way that's meaningful. So I explored that at some length in the book. And it ties back to this idea of the search for purpose and meaning. But so can you get that growth without the trauma? I think so, but I think it's hard work. It might involve somehow putting the brakes on. It seems to me that what's called for there is putting the brakes on everyday life and finding an opportunity to stop and contemplate and be contemplative, whether that's through a meditation or a retreat. Or do you see that in your work as well? I would guess so. The trappings of everyday life that I was discussing a minute ago, I think keep the blinders on in some respects. Right. I've gone through a couple of these experiences myself where you reach a point where you say, hey, what I'm doing just doesn't make sense. I need to make a change. And this was actually part of my thinking that I was describing my own career change when I left the world of corporate publishing to continue pursuing what I do now. And in part it wasn't particularly driven by anything traumatic other than some job insecurity, which is nothing compared to what I'm describing in this book. But it was driven by the idea of, hey, I don't get to live forever here. Maybe I have a couple of decades of useful work left. What do I want to do at that time? And I think that's in part what attracted me to writing Jolt too, because I tried with it. And I really got interested in this. Maybe some of your listeners know from your calls, the Encore.org conference. Is that an organization that people on this call would know about, or should I describe it a little bit?
Many of them do, but not everybody. So I think it would be great to.
It's an organization devoted to, it's a network and a research organization and kind of an inspiration network towards the idea of midlife career and life transformation towards social purpose. And it's a conference that I've attended for many years, and I know you have as well. And over the years,
I met you actually.
Exactly. Over the years, though, you sit in these breakout sessions where people who were attendants, who were going through these changes, would be telling their life stories and how the change happened. And I got to a point where I just started to notice the Jolt pattern. I wasn't calling it that time, but almost to the point where I could tell when I was about to hear something really awful that had happened to somebody, because they'd be telling the story and say, okay, I'm about to hear the awful trauma. And sure enough, I did. And I was hearing it often enough that I thought there's really something so intriguing here. So that was how I first got onto it, hearing people tell these stories, and I just vibe with them. Something else I wanted to mention, though, I don't want to leave the impression that all the folks that go through these are turning themselves into superheroes out to save the world or anything like that. Sometimes the changes are more subtle or internal. An example of that is a man named Andrew Revkin, who I tell his story in the book. Andy, the journalist, and he worked for the New York Times for many years. He was actually one of the very first journalists to start writing about climate change back in the 80s. And he was the founder of the New York Times .Earth blog. And Andy had a second interest in life that was important to him, which was music. He lives in the Hudson Valley area north of New York City, which is an epicenter of the folk music world. It's Beacon, New York, where Pete Seeger lived. Lots and lots of folk music folks live up there. And Andy is an accomplished musician, guitar, mandolin, banjo, and played with Pete Seeger. But it was a hobby for Andy. And he wrote music, but hadn't gotten serious about his own work. It was more just a secondary hobby. And one day he was in his early 50s. He was out for a jog, and he suffered a stroke, an ischemic stroke, while he was out jogging. And he survived that. He suffered a temporary paralysis in one hand and one side of his face, which was pretty scary for, number one, a younger person, but secondly, as a journalist and musician, to lose use of one of his hands was pretty frightening. And that event just shocked him to realize that this was the recognition of mortality that got him to refocus his attention on his music. And he talked about how he loved journalism, but his passion really in life was the music. And he wound up recording his own music and just spending much more time on that. And so he's sort of an example of that sort of experience.
It's just got me thinking about the different ages and stages of people. I think I mentioned to you on the phone a while ago that when I was in my 20s, I had an experience that was a jolt for me that sort of changed the trajectory of my life when I almost drowned and some strangers saw me and some people were able to save me. And it was, again, the confrontation with vulnerability and with mortality and what kind of purpose and meaning I wanted for my life. And I think it's influenced the trajectory of my life. And I speak about that often when I give talks. And thinking about that at my young age and thinking about some of the students, Parkland, and for some, it's been a jolt. And as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, there have been a couple of suicides, so it doesn't work for everybody. But I think it is that confrontation with trauma, and if it ends up being too overwhelming or it becomes the springboard of saying, I don't have forever, none of us have forever, what am I going to do with the time I have? Many of the examples you have, and I know just even in the introduction, Mark Friedman, who started Encore.org, he was talking about one of the issues of having longer lives, that there's more opportunities for second chances in life. And many of the people that you write about are in that mid-stage or later in life. But I'm trying to think about and would love some of your thoughts on some of the younger kids when the Parkland shootings or people where the Jolt was the Me Too movement. We're seeing so much of it, as you say, in plain sight.
Yeah, my interest in the topic did start with kind of people at midlife or later because of the work that I do. For the book, I made a point of including younger people, although not as young as kids at Parkland. This is highly speculative on my part. I haven't talked to any of those kids or done any research on the differences in a post-traumatic event like this for people who are at that formative age. Other than just to say, I think it's going to be fascinating to watch and see how that develops over time. In a way, you would think that, and this is really speculative on my part, I got to say, you would think that it could even be a more potent experience because for people who are in these formative years of life, so much happens when you're in your teen years that kind of sets your mindset for life, right? You would think that in some ways that this could even be a more indelible stamp, but like I say, I'm speculating there.
Right. Yeah.
But certainly the responses bear all the hallmarks of post-traumatic growth. There's no doubt about it. And having now written the book and done the research, it's just, I read so many stories in the news through that lens. I'm just seeing it all the time.
Yeah. I think when people read your book, they'll start seeing it all the time too. There's something, it's a jolt. The book is a jolt. So Don from Ontario has a comment and a question. He says, as people age and address the inevitable trauma that they've experienced in life, those who do not try to continually escape their suffering may face a dilemma, acceptance or activism. And he says, is it not very hard to summon enough energy for both?
Acceptance and...
He says acceptance or activism. So part of the question, as I read it myself, is part of the dilemma, perhaps, for people who experience the post-traumatic growth versus not, just that there's not maybe enough energy both to deal with the trauma and accept it versus have it take them in an active approach to life?
Gee, I don't know. Energy, it's hard for me to think about what that means, to be honest with you.
Okay.
I think, as I say, the choices vary. I don't know if I'm really addressing the question here, but I'll just point out that the types of responses vary quite a bit. They can be, it's funny, let me just mention this. One of the questions that I posed to one of the really leading researchers in this field, a gentleman named Lawrence Calhoun, I asked him if he could help me get a handle on the prevalence of the growth response. In other words, how often in the case of traumatic events is there a growth response? And his response to me in a tongue-in-cheek way was somewhere between 30 and 90% of the time. So I said, what do you mean by that? He said, it all depends on how you measure growth. That a growth response can be something extremely subtle. It can be as subtle as I wake up every morning with a new appreciation of what it means to be alive. And Calhoun would categorize that as a growth response. And then at the other end of the spectrum is the activism question, which is a much more externalized response. So depending on how you measure, the prevalence of growth changes quite a bit. So I have trouble with that. I'm sorry, I don't think I'm answering the question all that well, but I'm having trouble fitting the question into the model that I have in the way of thinking about post-traumatic growth.
So I'll just put out to Don if you want to submit any comment or other questions that may help clarify what you're wanting response to, that would be helpful. And I just want to encourage other people to send in your questions or comments. That would be helpful. So what about, you said early on, and I think it is important, and maybe it ties in a little bit with Don's question of, I mean, there are a lot of people who don't experience the kind of growth that you're talking about. And I agree with what you said at the beginning, that it's so important, not particularly if people are clinicians or coaches or even family members or friends, to assume that should be the outgrowth, and if not, that they're a failure. What have you learned about that, and what have you learned from some of the people? Because I know, as you said, you did interview some people who said that they didn't experience growth. Yeah. What's the difference happen?
Well, I think to me, what you're asking leads to the issue of what are the lessons one can draw from these stories, because as you point out, not everybody experiences it. To me, the lesson is just the value of change, how important change can be for people, whether that's personal or whether it's more externalized. Just to illustrate, one of the people I profile in the book is a young woman named Han Myers. And Han is actually one of the people I profiled who she's in her 30s, so on the younger end of the adult spectrum of people that I talk about, had started a career, an ambitious career, and she was trained as a lawyer, an ambitious litigator with a up-and-coming law firm, got married and had a child, and then suddenly her husband was diagnosed with an aggressive, fatal form of brain cancer, and he was dead within a year. And so here she was with a 1.5-year-old child, her life plan blown apart. And one of the things that really was striking to me about her story was, despite the pain, the transformational process was so valuable to her. She wound up giving up her work in law, completely quit the law, and decided to spend a year traveling the world with her son, her infant son, and started to pursue an interest in writing. Creative writing was really always her passion, but she felt by sort of family pressures driven to pursue a career in law. And so I just want to read a very brief passage about Han, if I could, that I think maybe illustrates this point. This is the beginning of the 7th chapter of the book, and the chapter is titled The Gift of Trauma. And it's about how Jolt survivors regard their traumatic events as this profoundly valuable gift of change. Let me just read briefly. I asked Han Myers this question: if you could wave a magic wand and return to your life as it was before the death of your husband, would you do it? She took a deep breath. Obviously, I would want John here, but if he's not going to be here, no, I wouldn't trade. If I had a choice, I want him to be there to share my life, but his death and Liam's birth clarified for me what living is supposed to be about. You can't take each day for granted. There are days I wish I was naive again, thinking I would work at a law firm, we'd have a house in the suburbs, have all these kids, and grow old together. But now I wouldn't want to go back to that naive state. And this is a question I pose to everybody I profile in the book. If you could wave a magic wand and go back to your life as it was before, would you do it? And none of them would do it. Now, the caveat I have to offer is for anybody who lost a loved one, a spouse or a child, of course they would wave the wand, the magic wand, and bring that person back. But that said, for example, Lucy McBath, I asked that question, and she said, I hate the way that I've come to the work, but it's what I was meant to do. It's where I'm gifted. So she found her way to the life that she feels she was meant to live through this very, very traumatic loss of her son, Jordan. And I just think that this really knocked me upside the head in understanding how people looked at these experiences, just how highly they value the change they went through. And that kind of is what led me to this exploration of the question, can I get the growth without the trauma? Because these are people who are saying the growth experience is so valuable that aren't there ways we can stop and ask ourselves questions that lead to growth experiences without the trauma? I think there can be.
So Dawn, first of all, came back and said, I believe that you, Mark, answered the question very well. She says It's just that older people have a longer term of life context to deal with, which he thinks changes the equation. So he said that, and then Sarah actually weighed in on the issue about addressing acceptance versus activism. This is Sarah from Woodstock. She says she was attacked by someone who held a hunting knife to her throat, and for a couple of years she spoke on the subject in person on TV, and she said she thinks it helped her get to acceptance and move on, so it no longer looms large in her life.
I'm so sorry to hear you experience that. That's a very interesting point that we haven't discussed so far, which is, I get the question a lot, how do you get people to open up and tell their stories? Because the stories are so painful. And first off, I would say that as a journalist, one of the fundamental things you learn about the work of interviewing people is that most people want to tell their story because they just do. It's how often do you get asked to tell your story, number one, and people have a fundamental interest in their own experiences. But in this case, what I found is that the storytelling, is being described here. Sarah, is that what you said? Yeah.
Sarah,
right?
Yeah.
Sarah, sorry. This comment that Sarah's making about the therapeutic value of storytelling, that's another theme that emerged for me, because a lot of the people who I profile in the book have told their stories maybe hundreds of times. It's retelling for a purpose. Marietta Yeager and Bill Pelkey come back to mind, the death penalty abolitionists, who both went through horrific losses of loved ones. Marietta was on a camping trip in the 1970s with her family out west, and her young daughter, one of her 4 kids, was kidnapped and murdered by a serial killer. Somebody was later captured. And she travels the world campaigning for abolition of the death penalty because she actually came to a place of forgiveness of the killer and worked to get him off death row. The killer ultimately committed suicide in prison, but she's devoted her entire life to this cause, and it very much involves her getting up and telling the story. I've heard her tell it many times, and it's just, I can't even describe to you what it's like to watch her get up in front of an audience of people and retell this story that she's told literally hundreds of times. She's well into her 80s at this point. But it really is a therapeutic experience for these folks. They really do. The story is central to who they are, remains central to who they are, even though they've found this way to, I don't want to say move past it exactly, but they've used the story has allowed them to leapfrog to a new place.
So do you have a sense of, I guess I have a question of, in terms of takeaways on both sides of it, are there steps that you've seen in terms of the process that could be helpful for people to think about what are ways to deal with a trauma that could potentially lead to a transformative growth?
It's not something I explore really, because I was really at pains not to make this a prescriptive book. I just felt it would be, what's the word, superficial, too easy. You know, how you too can recover from a traumatic life event. It's such an individual experience. The clinicians who I speak with in the book and rely on their expertise talk about just their own clinical experiences and working with patients. And they talk about how it's important to let people tell the stories, and they're always listening for a glimmer of a thought that there's an impulse towards something that's transformative. And when that does crop up, they're eager to explore it and help support it. But as I mentioned early on, it's not something that they want to ever impose on someone. I was trying to avoid easy prescriptive answers here. Yes, you too can survive and move on, because that's just not your own work. Yeah. That would be irresponsible, frankly. And I think of this as more of a journalistic thought of trying to tell the stories, and hence the name Stories of Trauma and Transformation.
Yeah, which I think you do beautifully. What about, you mentioned earlier, and so for those people who haven't experienced trauma, what do you see as some of the takeaways for them from your book?
I do think it's some of the things we've touched on. It's the idea that these stories can inspire and get people thinking about what changes they might want to make in their own lives. Because if these are people who managed to pick themselves up following just a devastating traumatic loss and do these things, I think it is an inspirational thing. One brief story I'll tell is that I had one couple who I described in the book. I'm not going to mention them by name. This is a personal exchange. That after the book, this was something I was not anticipating, that a couple of people who I profile in the book came back to me after reading it saying, gee, I felt inadequate after reading this because these other people you wrote about did so much more to make the world a better place than I did. And I'm just like, oh, don't feel that way. It is though judgment being brought to bear here. But I think that many of these stories, if you take them as they come and consider them in the context of the individuals, are just very inspiring. For me, personally, it's just reinforced this need to have a sense of urgency and purpose and to live mindfully and with a sense of gratitude. I think the people who inhabit this book really do teach us that if you're going to make changes, get on with it. You know, what are you waiting for? Right. Because life isn't forever and you never know what's around the corner. I really do think that is a lesson we can all embrace here. As you mentioned earlier, we discussed a little bit earlier, just contemplating the reality of our own mortality can help you focus the mind on the possibility of change, if I could put it that way. Maybe that's a good place to stop.
Except there's another question comment that I wanted to integrate, but we'll come back to that in a second. But Sandra from Seattle says, do you address the situation of those of us who grew up with early and developmental trauma and then suffered additional shock and stress traumas later on? Is there anyone in your book or experience who was able to experience post-traumatic growth from that situation? And she said, thank you. By the way, this is my situation. She says, only now in my 60s have I discovered somatic trauma healing, which I hope will eventually lead to the capacity for even more growth.
I do not address that. And I should mention that part of my perspective here is the trauma is obviously, it's just a gigantic topic. And there are many different themes and worthy of exploration inside the theme of trauma. This is not one that I got into in the book, because trying to, frankly, look at a very specific narrative of life is moving on in a certain way. You're living life in a certain way, something happens, and now something has changed before and after. So it's not something that I address. I don't know, maybe it's something, Dory, that you have had some insights into in your own work. I don't know.
I think there are many people who've had earlier traumas that impact life, and then I think it's with the perspective of age and maybe the opportunity, as you were just saying before, and that Mark says in the foreword, that at certain points in life we reach points when we recognize maybe there's an opportunity for another chance, a second chance, a way to process it with the added perspective and wisdom that we have with the additional years that we now have under our belt. Right. And I think that, and it is interesting to think that sometimes people may have felt stuck for many years, and then that experience at a later stage where you rework what happened or the subsequent traumas, and it's that new opportunity that leads to growth. And I think it probably still is a post-traumatic growth, because there's so much change and loss and trauma that people experience in life.
And I just don't happen to explore early childhood.
Right.
Trauma and how they can come back around. Although when we were talking earlier about the process of change and the amount of time and I was mentioning that I did run across a couple of people who seemed to have an instantaneous transformation. I do think a couple of those folks really doing in the background for a long time, something that was bugging them or feeling a need to make a change in their life. And I think to that extent, sometimes that could be something that could relate to an earlier traumatic event, perhaps, or not. But yeah, he says, you're saying, I think, the process can be complex. It's not cookie cutter.
Exactly. Which is what I think you accomplish in the book. And I think from my perspective of reading it too, they're very inspiring stories. And it's the kind of situations that you think about. I hope I don't have to confront some of those things, but how might the death of a child or the death of a spouse or just the different traumas that happen. And there's so many things that can jolt us to, taking life, taking life seriously, or just taking the fact that none of us have forever, and that it really can, it's what you said at the beginning, that purpose and meaning and gratitude and forgiveness. They're just beautiful stories of how people basically process the life they're in, and some really grow from it, and not everybody does.
Your comment has reminded me of another short passage related to Han Myers that I would love to read, if you don't mind. It's just a couple very short,
Great.
but I think it does encapsulate this. For Jolt survivors, change begins when their framework for living is demolished by pain and suffering. Yet most regard that destruction as a gift. They have clarity of mind and purpose and a heightened sense of compassion. Jolt survivors who have experienced the most dramatic transformations find themselves driven by a radically expanded sense of empathy for the plight of others and a powerful urge to help. But what lessons can others learn from the stories? How do these stories of change apply to people in less extraordinary circumstances? What about people experiencing more everyday problems, such as dissatisfaction with work, a job loss, relationship stress, or the ill health of a family member? Those may not be traumas large enough to force dramatic change, but, quote, things will happen in your life and it doesn't have to be dramatic, says Han Myers. No matter what it is, everyone is trying to recover from something, whether it's a bad childhood or a bad choice or the loss of a spouse. Everyone is suffering from something. You don't have to wait for a big traumatic thing to happen. You have a choice to be an active participant in your own life.
That's so beautifully said.
And you think about the context of this young woman who's gone through this awful loss of a husband with a young child, and yet this is how she's looking at it.
Right. It's a beautiful example of the way just life experiences can jolt us to not take things for granted, really, and to recognize there's some choices. Mark, can you mention, first of all, how people can get the book, and also about your new podcast series?
Great, thank you. Yeah, the book is available all the usual ways. I encourage people to patronize their local independent bookstore, if possible, which may not have it on the shelf, but certainly can order it for you. But it's available online from Amazon and all the usual spots. And I hope everyone will read it and enjoy it. The podcast that Dory is mentioning, so I do it's actually a newsletter plus podcast on retirement and aging topics that comes out weekly. And so there's a weekly podcast that is included in the newsletter that is done once a week, and that includes interviews with, basically I'm out there hunting for kind of the smartest people I can find on the retirement and aging beat. So it typically will be policy experts or somebody with a particular area of expertise such as Dory has, researchers, economists, other journalists and authors who cover the retirement and aging space. So that's something that comes out weekly, and it's a subscription newsletter. I do a sort of an abbreviated short version of the podcast that's put on the web for free, but the longer version of the podcast plus the weekly newsletter is a subscription.
Great. This has been wonderful. Is there any final takeaway comment you want to make, Mark, before we end?
I think we've explored the topic really thoroughly, and I certainly appreciate the questions. They were perceptive and sensitive and interesting, and hope you all read the book.
Great. And I do encourage people, as I said, it really found it very inspiring. And I think that it, just as you said, Mark, since you've written the book, and for those of us who've done work with trauma before, but I think there's something about thinking about the jolt and the different ways that people respond to trauma, that it's inspiring and an eye-opener. And there are just many takeaways, I think, for all of us, just as you said, to not take life for granted and to really think about, no matter what our age is, that we have these opportunities to live our life more authentically and with purpose and meaning, whether or not we've had a kick in the butt to do it, or just that there's this sense of it's time, as you were saying in your career, just it's time to listen to what's still not getting realized for you in your life. So thanks again, Mark, for taking
Thank
time,
you so much,
and I will
Dori.
send you. Okay.
Again, thanks to everybody.
Great.
Thanks to everybody for tuning in.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio with Dr. Dorian Mintzer. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show, listen to past episodes, or download our free retirement transition guide, visit revolutionizeyourretirementradio.com.